everyone. We would like to start, and thank you for coming this evening to the Z3 project and lecture. I would like to welcome Avi Melamed, and I'm sure you're going to learn a lot and enjoy this evening. Good luck.
Ladies and gentlemen, shalom. Good evening. I guess that you can all hear me well? Yes. Excellent, wonderful. I'm going to talk about the war from a geostrategic perspective. You have these two screens on both sides. It's the same screen, more or less. It's the same screen, so you could easily watch whichever one of them that you want to choose. So I'm going to start with some short introduction about Gaza. And then what you see in front of you, this is actually the itinerary of the session tonight, so that will be the first item that I will talk about. First, you see the map of Israel. You see it's a kind of like a three-dimensional map of Israel. The bright colors that you see, the bright areas, are representing Palestinian territories. You see to the right-hand side an area that is called the West Bank. It's also known as Judea and Samaria. It's also known as the Palestinian territories. It depends who talks, of course. And then to the left-hand side, you could see Gaza Strip, bordering the state of Egypt, the largest Arab state. Gaza Strip is about 8 by 20 miles, and it's populated by some 2 million Palestinians. Some contemporary milestones in the history of Gaza Strip in our times. Between 1948 and 1967, Gaza Strip was ruled by Egypt, but it was not annexed to Egypt. In 1967, following the 6 Days War, Israel occupied Gaza Strip, and Israel ruled Gaza Strip until 2005. During that period of time, the Israeli government established communities, some people call them settlements, in Gaza Strip, 21 communities or settlements, everyone is welcome to choose its own terminology, with some 10,000 Israeli citizens who lived in those settlements, and they were secured by Israeli soldiers that used to be located, based in Gaza Strip. In October 2005, Israeli government, following a law that was passed in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, known as the disengagement, Israeli government evacuated Gaza Strip totally. 21 settlements were evacuated, 10,000 Israeli settlers were relocated in Israel, and all the Israeli military forces that used to be in Gaza Strip left Gaza Strip. In parallel to that, Israel handed control over in Gaza Strip to the hands of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is an entity that was established following the Israel-PLO agreement from 1993 that is rather known by the name of the Oslo Accord. Following that agreement, the Palestinian Authority was formally established and formally recognized by the international community as the legitimate representative of the Palestinians. The rule of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza Strip didn't last long, because a year and a half later, in the summer of 2007, Hamas, a Palestinian Islamic movement that was born in Gaza Strip in the 1980s, Hamas conducted a coup, a military coup in Gaza Strip, violently terminating the rule of the Palestinian Authority, and since 2007, Hamas was governing Gaza Strip. As you probably all know, in October 7, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine, the second largest military organization in Gaza Strip, conducted a lethal attack on Israeli communities next to Gaza Strip. I'm sure that you are all familiar with the terrible events that happened this day, leaving behind some 1,200 Israeli killed, most of whom civilians, and 251 Israelis that were kidnapped to Gaza Strip. Talking about the hostages, right now in Gaza Strip, there are 134 Israeli hostages still in Gaza Strip, most of whom civilians, women, kids, senior citizens. We know for sure that at least 33 of those hostages are not alive. Unfortunately, it's very possible that the number of the dead hostages is bigger than that. Following the attack of Hamas and Islamic Jihad on October 7, Israeli government ordered the Israeli Defense Forces to operate in Gaza Strip, and Israeli government set 3 objectives to the Israeli Defense Forces. 1, to eliminate Hamas military power. 2, to bring, of course, try to bring back the hostages. And 3, to end Hamas rule in Gaza Strip. And ever since the end of October, there has been a massive Israeli military operation in Gaza Strip. Israel has been fighting Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants in Gaza Strip. You could see in front of you the statistics up to date provided by both Israelis spokesperson as well as Hamas Ministry of Health regarding fatalities and casualties. I would like to refer to the numbers provided by the Hamas Health Ministry. You could see those numbers in front of you. There is no actually way to verify those numbers, so the numbers could be maybe higher or maybe lower. We have to take those statistics cautiously because they are provided by Hamas-affiliated authority, but in the end of the day, for the time being, these are the numbers that are being referred to in the media discussion and international discussion. The war in Gaza Strip is a very, very complex war, and in fact, it's the most complex war possible for different reasons. First, it takes place in a massively urban area, and at the same time, it's a very small area. It's about 8 by 20 miles. One other reason is because Hamas and Islamic Jihad are actually mostly operating from within massively populated areas. They are basically operating from or under public facilities like schools and mosques and malls and hospitals and so on and so on. And one other thing that adds to the complexity is the fact that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are actually knowingly and intentionally using their own brothers and sisters as a human shield, hoping that there will be a large number of fatalities and casualties among the Palestinians. So that will be a tool in the hand of Hamas to put pressure on the international community to pressure Israel to stop the war. So Israel, while fighting in Gaza Strip, Israel is doing an enormous effort to try as much as possible to minimize collateral damage in Gaza Strip. And one of the ways that Israel is doing, you could see this map in front of you. This is a map of areas of Gaza Strip, the center part of Gaza Strip, Khan Yunis, and then you see to the left-hand side Rafah, that has been recently in the media headlines. That map is actually artificial in the sense that you could see it's divided to blocks, and each block is numbered. And the whole idea beyond that is that Israel provides that map to the Palestinians in Gaza Strip, both as a digital as well as a printed version. And the idea beyond that map and the numbers and the blocks is to give a notice in advance to the Palestinians to get out from areas that are supposed to become war zones. So, for example, the IDF sent messages to Palestinians saying, look, if you live in a block 22nd, 48, and 56, you have to evacuate within the next couple of hours because it's going to become a war zone. This is one of the methods Israel is applying in order to try to minimize collateral damage. Another thing is to create a safe corridors that will enable Palestinian civilians to move from one place in Gaza Strip towards the other, from the north to the south part of Gaza Strip. You see there are two parallel corridors. One is inland, colored in red. Part of this corridor does not exist any longer. Shortly we'll understand why. But the yellow one exists. You see that the yellow one is basically parallel to the promenade, the coastline. And the whole idea is to enable Palestinians that live in the northern part of Gaza Strip to move down to the south and take those corridors to be safe. So Israel provides a notice in advance saying to Palestinians from 9 o'clock to 2 o'clock you could use the yellow corridor, from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock you could use the red corridor, and that way to try and to, as much as possible, keep Palestinian civilians away from areas of fighting. As of now, one of the things that happens right now in Gaza Strip, Israel has established, you could see in front of you, this buffer zone. You see this red line that is cutting through the center part of Egypt, roughly speaking, basically dividing Gaza Strip to two parts. The northern part is to a large extent an area that civilians cannot go back to for the time being. And by the way, this is the part that was almost, also in relatively speaking, this is the part of Gaza Strip that was significantly damaged. The other part of Gaza Strip, relatively speaking, were less damaged, but the northern part of Gaza Strip, that was the part that was massively damaged. And so right now what happens is that Israel established this buffer zone, and this is actually, this red line that you see is a path, is a road that Israel paved during the war, crossing Gaza Strip from side to side, and along that road there are military posts, Israeli military posts, that are supposed to monitor movement of civilians, and also at the same time act as a basis from which Israel is continually launching pinpoint local raids to eliminate or to clean, sort of speaking, remains of Hamas and militant Islamic jihad groups that are still operating in this area of Gaza Strip. So this is, roughly speaking, the situation on the ground, the update, and now I want to talk a little bit about how did we get here. And I want to contextualize it, and I would say as an opening statement that this war didn't start in October 7th. Israel has been dealing with Hamas and Islamic Jihad for now 40 years. I remember myself in my early days in intelligence counter-terror branch, where my superior came to me and says, look, there is this organization called Islamic Jihad in Palestine. We have no knowledge about this organization. This is your portfolio, good luck. And it was like something like 30 years ago, so you can understand the period of time. And I think that it's important to understand that this war is actually a conjunction of two major processes that took place in the Middle East for many decades, actually. And the conjunction of these two major processes, in the end of the day, results what we see right now. One process has to do with the inner Palestinian power struggle over leadership, and the other one has to do with the story of the Iranian hegemonic vision. Let me start saying a few words about the inner Palestinian power struggle, and I want to contextualize that. And the context is a wide power struggle that took place in the Arab world and the Muslim world in the 20th century, and this is the power struggle regarding what is known as the national statehood. We need to remember that most of the history, people in this region lived under Muslim entities in the Middle East, mostly under the rule of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The concept of national statehood was totally alien to the people in the region. And so following WW1, when the Turkish Ottoman Empire came to an end and people in the region were introduced to the concept of national statehood, right there has been an evolving debate ideologically, politically, culturally, emotionally between different camps in the Muslim and the Arab world regarding this whole thing that is known as national statehood. One major camp engaged in this debate was the Islamic camp, and its most well-known representative, the biggest mass movement in the Muslim Sunni world that is known by the name of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood were established in Egypt in 1920s, and the Muslim Brotherhood totally rejects the concept of national statehood. They say this is a totally alien concept, it's alien to Islam, it's a Christian concept, it's a Western concept, we don't accept it. And the Muslim Brotherhood alternatively vows or envisioned to create a global entity that is called caliphate. And the caliphate should be ruled according to the Islamic religious codex that is rather known by the name of Sharia law. You may wonder why should people live their life according to Sharia law? Because Islamic theologist says Sharia law is the master plan that was given to mankind by Allah himself, and therefore it's flawless, it's perfect. One other thing that features the Muslim Brotherhood is their non-compromising animosity towards Jews, towards the Zionist movement, and later on when the State of Israel was established in 1948, also their non-compromising animosity towards the State of Israel. The Muslim Brotherhood ideologically, politically, pragmatically called for the elimination of the State of Israel. 60 years after the Muslim Brotherhood were born in Egypt, in Gaza Strip in the 1980s, Hamas was born. Hamas is a word in Arabic which means a religious enthusiasm, and it's also the initials, I will say it in Arabic and I will translate, of Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the Islamic resistance movement. I want you to remember this term, the resistance. We'll talk about it later on because it's very significant. And Hamas formally defines itself as the offspring of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine, meaning that Hamas is coming from the ideological hub of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so, as such, for example, Hamas ideologically rejects the concept of national statehood. It's a little bit ironic because, you know, there are some circles in the West that echoes the slogan from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They are thinking that by echoing that, they are basically echoing Hamas' objective. That is not Hamas' objective. Hamas views an independent Palestinian state that will be established on the ruins of the state of Israel and only as a transitional phase, as a station towards the final destination, and this is the caliphate. Being offspring of the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, Hamas totally refused to recognize Israel's right to exist. Hamas is not willing to recognize Israel's right to exist, and Hamas vows to eliminate the state of Israel through the use of violence. So this is Hamas, a major Palestinian player, and the other major Palestinian player is Fatah. Fatah, which is the spine of the Palestinian Authority, Fatah was established before Hamas in the late 1950s. And Fatah comes from the camp that endorses the concept of national statehood. Fatah rejects the concept of caliphate. Fatah wants to see an independent Palestinian state. Differently from Hamas, who, as part of its ideology, endorses the concept of running the entity according to the Islamic religious codex, the Sharia law, Fatah says no. Running the entity should be done based upon a parliamentary-based process. And the whole issue of living your life, if you are a Muslim according to a Sharia law, this is something that is a personal, individual choice. The reason Hamas objects, the reason Fatah objects the imposing of Sharia law is because there are members of Fatah and there are members of the Palestinians who are Christians. They are not Muslims. And finally, when the PLO, of which Fatah is a major spine, when the PLO signed the agreement with Israel in 1993, by doing that practically, and I emphasize practically, not formally, Fatah basically accepted the idea of the two-state solution and recognizing Israel's right to exist. So right there, you see there are two major Palestinian factors. They are fighting over leadership of the Palestinian people. Each one of them wants to position itself as the one and only leader of the Palestinian people. And the power struggle between the two intensified following 2007, when Hamas took over violently Gaza Strip, crushing the rule of Fatah, the Palestinian Authority in Gaza Strip in 2007. And all the attempts of Muslims leaders since then to reconcile Fatah and Hamas, all those attempts failed. So this is one process. The other one has to do with the story of the Iranian hegemonic vision, and I want to again contextualize that. There are two major axes of power struggle that shapes the Middle East through the centuries. One is a power struggle within Islam itself. Islam is the major religion of most people in the Middle East. Islam emerged in the Middle East in the 7th century, very quickly becoming a conquering empire, establishing a caliphate. The more the caliphate was expanding, there has been a growing power struggle within that caliphate regarding the question who is entitled to lead the Muslim world, who is entitled to rule that caliphate. And that power struggle resulted in two major camps in Islam. Majority of the Muslims are Sunnis, about 85%, and the Sunnis argue that leading the Muslim world should be done by the person that has the skills to do that task. It's not about bloodline. The other camp, the Shiites, Shiite is a word in Arabic which means political faction. The Shiites argue that leading the Muslim world should be done only by a male descendant of the fourth caliph, the fourth king of the Muslim empire, Ali bin Abi Talib, that was the son-in-law and cousin of Prophet Muhammad. He was assassinated in the middle of the 7th century, and so his two sons, he had two sons from his marriage with Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad. And so that power struggle resulted in the split, resulting in the Sunni camp, majority, 85%, that actually arguing leading the Muslim world should be done by the person that has the skill, and the Shiites, minority, some 12%, that argue leading the Muslim world can be done only by a male descendant of the fourth caliph. And there are major theological and cultural and emotional gaps between Sunnis and Shiites in Islam, and non-compromising animosity between these two camps. They have been butchering each other for the last 1400 years. This is one axis of power struggle. The other one is a power struggle between three major Muslim civilizations in the region. One is the Arab civilization. You could see it represented on the left-hand side of the screen. The script that you see is the script in Arabic reads Allah, the God. Islam was born in the Arab civilization in the 7th century. And most of the Arabs are Sunni Muslims. In the middle, you see the lion that represents the Persian civilizations. The Persians are not Arabs. They are not from the Arab Peninsula. They are from Persia. And they are not Arabs. They don't speak Arabic. They speak Farsi. And most of the Persians are Shiites. And then to the left-hand side, you see the red crescent that represents Turkey. Turkey are neither Arab nor Persians. They are not from the Arab Peninsula. They are not from Persia. They are from Central Asia. They don't speak Arabic. They don't speak Farsi. They speak Turkish. Most of the Turks are Sunnis. So you got Arab predominantly Sunni, Turkish predominantly Sunni, and Persian predominantly Shiite. And they are fighting for influence and hegemony in the region for centuries. So these are the two major axes of power struggle that shapes this region all along the history. Now coming to our times. In 1979, there is a dramatic development in the Middle East. Islamic revolution in Iran. Iran becomes a Shiite theocracy under the leadership of what is known as the mullah regime. Mullahs are the Shiite clergies, and they are actually structured like officers in the army. They have different ranks. You probably are familiar with the founder of the Islamic revolution, Ruhollah Ayatollah Khomeini. Ruhollah Ayatollah is not his name, this is his rank. And so the mullah regime that came to power in Iran in 1979 obviously is inspired to its core by the different Shiite narratives. And one of the deepest Shiite narrative is the one that says, we, the Shiites, we were supposed to lead the Muslim world, but when Ali bin Abi Talib was assassinated and his sons were assassinated, the Sunni Arab stolen from us the crown of leadership. This is the Shiite narrative, which is, by the way, their narrative, but it's not necessarily reflecting the historical accuracy. Just the same, this is a major Shiite narratives, and so the Shiites are motivated by this deep feeling that they have been deprived of the right to lead the Muslim world. So when the mullah regime came to power in Iran, inspired by that narrative, by the way, this is a regime that is very much revolutionary in its outlook. It also has some very strong apocalyptic perspective in its ideology. And so the mullah regime translated this narrative of being victim or being deprived of the right to lead the Muslim world. The mullah regime translated it into an action plan, an expansion, aggressive, proactive expansion plan in the Middle East aimed to basically position the mullah regime as the leading superpower in the region. And that master plan basically has been known by the name of the Shiite Crescent. This is a title, by the way, that was given to this master plan by the Jordanian king, the current king, Abdullah II, who talked about it already in 2004 and alarmed. And he said, beware of the Shiite Crescent, because he said, this Shiite Crescent is going to be mostly at the expense of the Arab world. And he was definitely right. When you look today across the Middle East, you could see that the mullah regime was very successfully advancing its master plan. And one of the major platforms that the mullah regime has been effectively using to advance its vision is by positioning itself as the spearhead of a camp that is known in the region by the name of the axis of resistance. In Arabic, it's known as محور المقاومة والممانعة, the axis of resistance and defiance. The ideology of resistance is very much present in the discussion, the political, emotional, intellectual, cultural discussion of the Middle East. And this is an ideology that has some very interesting features. One of them is totally rejection of the West and its values. The other one is commitment to end the Western presence in the region. There is another significant feature of that ideology, and this is the non-compromising animosity to the state of Israel and vowing to eliminate the state of Israel through the use of violence. It is justified by the saying that Israel is an artificial entity that was established by the Western colonialistic, imperialistic powers, the Christian powers, and Israel was implanted in the Middle East. It's not indigenous to the Middle East, and therefore it has to be outroot. Very often, Israel is defined by the axis of the resistance as the, I will say it in Arabic, al-kiyan al-ghasib, which means the rapist entity, and therefore it has to be outroot. And this whole ideology of the resistance was channeled into one major slogan, and this is liberating Palestine. In other words, the mullah regime basically positioned itself, market itself to the region as the one that will liberate Palestine. Why did the mullah regime did that? Because remember, in order to create this Shiite crescent of influence, it has to be mostly at the expense of Arab states who are predominantly Arabs and Sunnis. So the mullah regime needs to find a way to bypass the suspicious and the resentment of the Arab Sunnis towards the mullah regime. And the mechanism that they find was by portraying themselves as the one that liberate Palestine. And so in that service, or in that context, the mullah regime basically creates a network of armies of terror, proxies, across the Middle East, deeply entrenched mostly in Arab states. And this network is rather known by the name of the axis of resistance. And when you look at this network of proxies or armies of terror that the mullah regime supports, arms and finance across the Middle East, you find some interesting features. First, none of those militias is based upon Iranians. You will not find Iranians in those militias. They are based upon Arabs, most of them. So in Lebanon, an Arab state that borders Israel from the north, in the 1980s, the mullah regime is establishing what is going to become its most powerful proxy, a Lebanese-based organization that is called Hezbollah. You probably heard this name. Hezbollah is two words in Arabic, which means the party of God. The Hezbollah in Lebanon is based upon Lebanese, Arabs, most of them Shiites. It's part and parcel of the Lebanese structure. It is part of the government. It has political party. And it has an independent military might that was provided to the Hezbollah by the Iranians. And so when the Lebanese people turned to the Hezbollah and said, look, you have to disarm yourself because we have army, we have government, you are part of this government, the Hezbollah says to the Lebanese, don't you dare touching this weapon. This is the holy weapon of the resistance. And that weapon will liberate Palestine. What happened with that weapon was that it was mostly used to occupy Lebanon from within. Lebanon became an Iranian satellite because the Hezbollah dictates and terrorizes the Lebanese with its weapons. So this is the example of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. In Syria and other Arab states that border Israel from the northeast, as you probably know, since 2011, there is a war going on in Syria. And the Iranian regime massively involved in this war to support Assad regime. Assad regime in Syria is very significant to Iran because it's strategic partner and it's the linchpin in the Iranian master plan to create, as part of the Shiite crescent, to create a land corridor, you could see that on the map, that connects physically through the land, Iran, crossing through Iraq, Syria, and ending in Lebanon, and creating this land corridor that will be totally under Iranian influence. In that regard, Assad regime is a linchpin because Assad is providing the logistic backing for the Hezbollah in Lebanon. In Syria, the Iranians are deploying military forces. They send to Syria Hezbollah militants. They send Afghan Shiite militias. They send Pakistani Shiite militias. They send Iraqi Shiite militias to participate in the war to save Assad. And so Syria, under the rule of Assad, became the most significant component, the critical component, in the Iranian master plan. That is the reason why the Iranians are so massively invested in the war in Syria since its very early days. In Iraq, another interesting phenomenon, in Iraq there are three major communities. The largest population in Iraq are Shiites, they are about 65%. And then you got Sunnis and Kurds. In Iraq, the Iranian regime was able to create also a power base in the shape of Iraqi Shiite militias that are known by the name of Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, the Popular Mobilizations Unit, PMU. Those militias are based upon Iraqi Shiites. They are part of the Iraqi military establishment. Their weapons and ammunition is provided to them by the Iraqi government. Their salaries are coming from the Iraqi government, and they are obeying the orders of Iran. They are loyal to Iran. They are serving as an Iranian proxies inside Iraq. So you may wonder, how is it possible, like the case of the Hezbollah? The answer for that is that, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Iraqi Shiite militias basically says, yes, we are Iraqi Arabs. We are Iraqis in our nationality. We are Arabs in our ethnicity. But our core identity is the fact that we are Shiites, and we view the mullah regime in Iran as the source of authority. The same applies with the story of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, in many of his speeches, once said in Arabic, "Akli wa shurbi wa slahi min Iran." My food, my drink, my weapon is from Iran. I am a servant of the Iranian regime. Another interesting proxy you could see down in a place called Yemen. This is a proxy that recently came to the media headlines, the Houthis. The Houthis are Shiite tribes in Yemen. They are about 35%. Majority of the Yemenites are Sunnis, but the Houthis are 35% of the population, traditionally based in north part of Yemen. In 2014, the Houthis launched a military coup, ousting a legitimate Yemenite government of Yemen that was predominantly Sunni. The government fled down to Aden in the south part of Yemen, and ever since then there is a war going on in Yemen. The Houthis, as you could imagine, are massively supported and armed by the Iranians, and the ousted Yemenite government are supported by the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates, roughly speaking. So these are kind of like the militias, the structure that the Iranian regime established in the region. And then there is another interesting proxy or agent or subcontractor, if you wish, that is located in Gaza Strip. You see the yellow symbol on the map that represents Gaza Strip, and it basically represents Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine. They are very significant components, and they have a very significant role in the Iranian master plan as part of the axis of resistance. Shortly, we'll understand what is exactly their role. And there is something interesting to say about Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Unlike all other Iranian proxies that I mentioned, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are not Shiites. They are Sunnis. The Palestinians are Sunnis. So you may wonder what brings Hamas and Islamic Jihad Sunnis together with the mullah regime and the Shiite militias. The answer is they are all part of this axis of resistance, and they all vote to eliminate the state of Israel through the use of violence. One significant component in this Iranian master plan to eliminate the state of Israel through the use of conventional weapon, not non-conventional, but conventional weapon, is what we call the Ring of Fire. The blueprints of the Ring of Fire is basically based on the presence of an Iranian proxies today in a loop around Israel's neck. We got Hezbollah already existing in Lebanon with a huge military might. We got in Syria, Iraqi, Afghan, and Pakistani Shiite militias that are backed by the Iranians, and also, of course, Assad regime. And in Gaza Strip, we have Hamas and Islamic Jihad, also massively supported, armed, trained by the Mullah regime. And the idea is to create this loop around Israel's neck that creates what we call Ring of Fire, and that Ring of Fire, in the end of the day, will eliminate the state of Israel. The concept of the Ring of Fire has some interesting features. One of the most significant components of that is that it is a part of a long-term plan. The Mullah regime defines itself or describes itself as one that has a strategic patience. The Mullah regime is a marathon runner. And so in that regards, one of the most significant components of the Ring of Fire is to exhaust Israel in a long-term process. Now we could understand what is the role of Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the service of the Mullah regime. The role of Hamas and Islamic Jihad is to be the one that exhausts Israel. And indeed, when you look for the last 40 years, this is exactly what they have been doing, and particularly following 2007. It's not by chance. All the military rounds that we saw between Israel and Gaza Strip, and particularly following 2007 when Hamas took over, they are not random. They are part of this master plan. This is all part of the plan that aims to exhaust Israel through these repeating military rounds. So now we understand why Hamas and Islamic Jihad are so significant for the Mullah regime, because they are the ones that are perpetuating the conflict and escalating the conflict. Why does it serve the Mullah regime? Because the more the conflict escalates, the Mullah regime can continue and market itself to the Arab world as the one that will liberate Palestine. And to that objective, the Mullah regime says to the Arab world, well, we need to arm our militias so they could go and free Palestine. Remember what we said about the weapons of the Hezbollah. This is the holy weapon that will liberate Palestine. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are saying the same. When the Palestinian Authority and one of the demands of the Palestinian Authority from Hamas and Islamic Jihad is to disarm themselves, because you can't have two different or three different military Palestinian forces. Hamas and Islamic Jihad saying exactly like Hezbollah, don't you touch this weapon. This is the holy weapon of the resistance. This is the weapon that will liberate Palestine. And in the end of the day, this is a weapon that is being used in the context of the inner Palestinian power struggle, like, for example, what happened in 2007. One other interesting feature of this Ring of Fire is what is known as the unifying of the arenas. In Arabic, it's called Wihdat al-Sahat. The concept of unifying of the arenas basically says that when the day will come, all those militias will join hands together and they will simultaneously attack Israel from all directions. Dozens and thousands of missiles and rockets and assaulting drone will rain down on Israel every day. Thousands of militants will storm Israel from all directions, and Israel will be eliminated. Understanding that, you can understand why Israel has been attacking in Syria for the last couple of years hundreds of times. The Israeli attacks in Syria aims to disintegrate, to break this ring of fire by eliminating the Iranian attempts to create this military infrastructure in Syria that would be or should be, according to the ring of fire, one day directed at Israel. So that brings us to the question, why did Hamas launch this war? There are a couple of explanations that we can point out. One, a couple of them are things that we already talked about, like, for example, the power struggle between Hamas and Fatah. Hamas apparently launched this war saying, I will launch this war and I will decisively win the power struggle against Fatah. I will position myself, Hamas, as the one and only leader of the Palestinian people, and I will defeat my rivalry, Fatah. The other thing which is very significant is that apparently Hamas launched this war under the impression that the time has come for unifying the arenas. In Hamas master plan, actually October 7 was supposed to be that day. Now, during 2023, before the war, there has been meeting of the leaders of those militias, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iraqi Shiite militias, Houthis. Those meetings took place in Beirut, in Baghdad, and Iran, including meeting in August with the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. And when Hamas and Islamic Jihad met their colleagues, what they heard from them was, they say to them in Arabic, they said, "Ihna jahizun," which means in Arabic, we are willing, ready, and able. So apparently Hamas and Islamic Jihad were under the impression that launching the war on October 7, this is the day where all arenas will come together as one. One other reason that definitely pushed Hamas to launch this war was the whole process of rapprochement between Israel and Arab states. As you probably know, and particularly in the last couple of years, there has been a process of rapprochement. You may remember the Abraham Accords, set of agreements that were signed between Israel and United Arab Emirates, Israel and Bahrain, Israel and Sudan, Israel and Morocco. And those agreements are adding to the existing peace agreement between Israel and Egypt that was signed in 1979 and the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement from 1994. This process of acceptance of Israel in the region is very disturbing for the Palestinians. They are very disappointed and they are very annoyed, resentful of this process because they feel that their brothers, the Arabs, are deserting them. And that those sentiments have been further emphasized and boosted against the background of the Israeli-Saudi rapprochement, particularly in 2023. So it is apparently that Hamas was launching this war trying to reverse the process of rapprochement between Israel and Arab states, which, by the way, is also an Iranian interest. So, are we heading towards a multi-front war? This is a question that has been out there since day one of the war. And what we see so far is that the Mullah regime has been applying a very interesting, sophisticated tactic. And the purpose of this tactic is to prevent the downfall of Hamas rule in Gaza Strip. Now we understand, as I was talking before earlier, we understand how significant is Hamas rule in Gaza Strip for the Iranian regime. The Mullah regime doesn't care about the Palestinians. He couldn't care less. He butchered thousands of Palestinians in the war in Syria. But Hamas and Islamic Jihad are very valuable for the Mullah regime because they are perpetuating the conflict, as I was explaining before. So the Mullah regime is looking for a way to stop the war and to save Hamas rule in Gaza Strip. And the tactic applied is to activate the different proxies of the Mullah regime across the region to put simultaneously an increasing military pressure on both Israel and the United States and also on the world. And the purpose of this increasing military pressure is, in the end of the day, to cause international and US pressure on Israel to stop the war. And so what we saw since the beginning of this war, we saw in different arenas across the region how this tactic has been applied. For example, there has been more than 200 attacks carried out by Iraqi Shiite militias, those that are backed by the Iranians, against United States military presence in Syria and Iraq. In the south, the Houthis in Yemen are conducting attacks on maritime, on global trade in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandab Strait. You could see the maps in front of you, and you could see the Red Sea is one of the most strategic locations in this planet because it connects the eastern basin of the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. Some 40% of the trade between Europe and Southeast Asia is going through the Red Sea. And you could see that there is a narrow passage, a bottleneck, between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. This is the Bab el-Mandab Strait. And this is the area where the Houthis are mostly focusing their attacks against maritime and shipping, basically causing an increasing damage to global trade. In addition to that, the Houthis have been constantly attacking Israel, firing missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, sending and attacking drones to Israel, which is located some 1,000 miles away from Yemen. All these weapons, of course, are Iranian-made, and the training and the military know-how is provided by the Iranians. In another arena, along the Israeli northern border, we see the skirmish between Israel and Hezbollah since day one of the war. It is quite confined, it's restrained, it's kind of like what I call it takes place in a twilight zone between what I call the red line and the orange line. Meaning both sides, Israel and the Hezbollah, up until now, they are restrained and confined in their skirmish, in their mutual punches, being careful not to cross some red lines out of concern that it may result in a deterioration, a quick deterioration, slippery slope that will result in a spinning out of control of the situation that might result in a massive eruption regionally. So far, 5 months into this war, we see that this tactic has been and is applied on the ground by the Iranians and their proxies. Up until now, it has not spun out of control, but it has the potential to lead into a massive deterioration. Another interesting aspect to explore is the Arab world and the war. Now, as you could of course understand, in the Arab world there is a lot of solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza Strip. Obviously, Israel is portrayed in the Arab world as a monster that basically is destroying and killing people and kids in Gaza Strip, which is of course very understandable when you think about the fact that Palestinians in the end of the day are brothers to faith and ethnicity of the Arab world. However, parallel to that, there is a major criticism on Hamas in the Arab world. And this is something that I would like to elaborate a little bit, because ironically speaking, while there are some circles in the West that constantly insist to exempt Hamas from responsibility before October 7 and after October 7, there has been before October 7 and particularly after October 7, there is an enormous mounting criticism in the Arab world on Hamas. The criticism of the Arab world on Hamas is focusing on 3 major points. One, the Arab world says to Hamas, they said, look, you conducted a military coup in 2007 and you eliminated the rule of the Palestinian Authority, your brothers, and by doing that, you've totally torn apart the Palestinian people and you damaged the Palestinian cause. Because ever since then, all the attempts to heal or reconcile the parts failed. The second component of criticism in the Arab world on Hamas says, look, you dictating your radical agenda by initiating these military rounds against Israel, and particularly after 2007. But in the end of the day, those rounds only led Gaza Strip to a dead-end strip. You didn't really gain anything substantial. You just once and time again, you dragged your brothers and sisters in Gaza Strip to this dead-end street with no real substantial objectives. And the third component of criticism, which is basically the most, I would say, emphasized one, is saying to Hamas, they say, look, the Arab world says, look, you are sacrificing your own brothers and sisters, literally, in Gaza Strip. You are sacrificing them deliberately, knowingly, at the altar of the mullah regime in Tehran. This is the same regime that is butchering your own brothers, the Arabs, in Syria, including, by the way, Palestinians. This is the same mullah regime that butchers Lebanese and Iraqis and Yemenites, your brothers to ethnicity, in most of the cases also to Islamic denomination as Sunnis. So how can you do that? And you know, it's interesting, when the former leader of the Iranian Al-Quds force, this is the elite force within the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, that force, Al-Quds force, is the one that is operating and orchestrating the whole work of those militias. The former leader, commander of this force, General Qasem Soleimani, was eliminated by the United States in January 2020. And following the elimination of Soleimani, in the Arab world, people were celebrating because he was the executor of this Iranian plan that caused the life of hundreds of thousands, if not more, of Arabs across the Middle East. In Gaza Strip, Hamas and Islamic Jihad hanged a huge billboard mourning the death of Soleimani. So people in Gaza Strip burned down to the ground those billboards because they said to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, how can you put these billboards? This person is responsible for the killing of hundreds of thousands of our brothers and sisters, including in Gaza Strip. So you see that the criticism on Hamas is mounting in the Arab world, and those are what you see in front of you. You see just a couple of examples of that criticism manifested in some cartoons in the Arab world. If you look, for example, in the upper part, in the right-hand side, you see the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. He is like a puppeteer, and he's holding two puppets in his hands. One, of course, it's in Arabic. One reads Hamas, the other one reads Islamic Jihad. These are the two major Palestinian Islamic groups in Gaza Strip. And beneath, you see this urban area, and the script in Arabic reads Qita' Gaza, which means Gaza Strip. The message here is very clear. Hamas and Jihad, you are puppets in the hand of the puppeteer, the Iranians, and the people that pays the price are the people in Gaza Strip. In the lower part, you see an interesting, you see something similar just beneath that. You see once again the Iranian regime. Now, this time the gloves are representing other proxies. The red one is standing for Hezbollah in Lebanon. The other one represents the Houthis, but it's the same concept. Next to that, you see an interesting cartoon that was published following October 7 by a very major leading cartoon artist in the Arab world, Amjad Rasmi. And you see that there are two parts of that cartoon. You see that there is part one, you see the Iranian regime, the figure standing and giving the sign, shooting with his pistol and basically setting the runners to their course. You see there are next to the standing figure, there are two figures. One is the white one, which represents Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and then next to that, there is a black figure with a yellow bandana that represents Hezbollah and other proxies of the Iranians. So the signal has been given, and Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the white figure, disappears. They run to fight Israel. You see there is an arrow with the Israeli Star of David, and they run to fight Israel, but the black figure that represents Hezbollah and the other militias basically remains in its place. And if you look closely, you could see that it is actually chained to the Iranian regime. The message beyond that is that the Arab message to the Hamas and Islamic Jihad is that you have inflicted the biggest catastrophe ever on the people of the Palestinian people because you believed the Iranian regime and you believed the concept of unifying the arenas. Wahdat al-Sahat. You really thought that in October 7, when you launched this war against Israel, your colleagues will join in, Hezbollah, the Iraqi Shiite militias, the Iranian forces in Syria and others. And basically what happened is that you, to a large extent, you waged the war on Israel. Now you are facing Israel's rage. Gaza Strip is destroyed. There are enormous disastrous outcomes to your war in Gaza Strip. but your colleagues that you believe them, those that you all the time said they will join us, they did not join you. You basically sacrificed your brothers and sisters because you believed the Mullah regime and you believed your colleagues and the axis of resistance. It's interesting to see how Hamas is pushing back on that criticism. So in January 21st, Hamas published an 18-page document in English and in Arabic. It was published in Instagram, and providing 5 reasons why he launched this war. When you read the Arabic document, it's very clear that it's an apologetic document. Hamas is trying to justify its decision. It's pushing back against the criticism. It didn't really work because the criticism continued and mount in the Arab world. And now Hamas turned to another strategy where basically he kind of like now attacking the Arab world proactively, aggressively. And so, for example, if you look to the left-hand side, you see this cartoon that was published in Al Jazeera. You probably are familiar with Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is a Qatari-owned news network, very influential. By the way, it has a very bad reputation, including in the Middle East, and for good reasons. In the Middle East, Al Jazeera is quite often described as the newsmakers, not the news reporters. And Al Jazeera, by the way, is, since day one of this war, Al Jazeera is acting as the advocate of Hamas. It advocates and acts as a propaganda profiler of Hamas. And so this cartoon that you see to the left-hand side, published in Al Jazeera, illustrates the interesting strategy that Hamas tries to apply in order to push back the criticism. You see the militant, and this militant is offering the Arab world its lost pride, its lost dignity. You see that there is something in the box. I don't know if you can identify what is in the box. It's a mustache, right? Why mustache? Because in the Arab culture, in narratives, mustache is a sign of manhood, and manhood is associated with dignity and pride. And the message beyond that is that Hamas says to the Arab world, he says, look, we initiated this war. What we are doing is actually we are offering you your lost pride, your lost dignity. Then there is another interesting subtext in this cartoon. When you look at the figure, there is nothing about this figure that says that it's Hamas. If you look at the sleeve, you see that he is wearing the Palestinian flag, not Hamas flag. And the bandana that he wears on his head doesn't say Hamas, it says the resistance, al-muqawama. The subtext is actually that Hamas is saying to the Arab world, it's not only us, Hamas, that launched this war, it's all of us, the Palestinians. They are basically bringing to the umbrella all the Palestinians. Basically, obviously, that way Hamas trying to kind of like, justify or, clean itself from responsibility. Because remember again, in the context of the inner Palestinian power struggle, as of now, Hamas is in the losing corner because the Arab world says to Hamas, you have caused the biggest catastrophe on the Palestinian people. The Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, who is also the chairman of Fatah, obviously monetized. And in every possible stage, he basically said, now you see who was the responsible adult, and now you see who was the non-responsible adult. So Hamas, of course, is trying to do some damage control in the context of the political power struggle. Finally, some concluding notes. Look, I would start and say something that I think has to be understood. Hamas is not going to disappear. Hamas is part and parcel of the Palestinian people. It's part of the region. It's coming from the origin of the Muslim Brotherhood. It has a lot of roots. It's not going to disappear. So talking about eliminating Hamas and so on, it's totally irrelevant. It's not realistic. The objective here, in the end of the day, is to shrink Hamas' role and ability to continue and to dictate its radical agenda as it was unfortunately quite successfully doing for the last 40 years. That's the objective. And the way to achieve that involves 3 major components. One is to eliminate Hamas military power, or the spine of the military power, which is exactly what Israel is doing right now in Gaza Strip. Two is to end Hamas rule in Gaza Strip. And three is to bring into the picture major regional players, namely Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, that has interest, its own interest, to create a new conditions on the ground in the context of Gaza Strip. One of the major common denominators of those states that I mentioned is that they all view Hamas as a threat to their own national security. Last week, Egyptian court sentenced to death 8 leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas members are locked and imprisoned in Saudi Arabia. Jordan, who is the monarchy in Jordan, who is dealing with a very vocal and proactive Islamic circles, that some of them are even challenging the legitimacy of the monarchy. The Jordanians are very concerned with the ability of Hamas to fuel those circles in Jordan. United Arab Emirates also defines the Muslim Brotherhood as a terror organization. So there is an interest of those players to shrink as much as possible Hamas' role. They know that it's not going to disappear. They just want to see Hamas shrink to the point it will not be able to continue and to dictate its radical agenda. And those are the 3 major components that are required to bring Hamas to that specific niche that I was talking about right now. One other thing that obviously the war clearly manifests is the threat, the dangerous threat that the Mullah regime presents, not only to Israel, not only to the region, but now to the world. It's very clear. You know, we can illustrate and sum it up and say, dude, I'm saying like, you got one proxy of the Iranians, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, that are holding Israelis hostages, physically. You got another proxy, the Hezbollah, that holds both Israelis and Lebanese as hostages. Now, you know, some 80,000 Israelis became hostages from the north because they can't live in their communities, they have to evacuate. At the same time, some 100,000 Lebanese from South Lebanon have to evacuate, to flee to the north part of Lebanon or to the center because of the skirmish between Hezbollah and Israel. The Houthis are basically holding the world hostage by attacking the maritime and the shipping and the trade in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So these are things that actually illustrates the danger, the threat that the Mullah regime presents, and that threat has to be decisively addressed. One other significant thing, this is not only a pivotal moment in the context of Israel and the Palestinian or the region. This is a pivotal moment in the context of, I would say, the West and the Western discussion vis-a-vis the whole story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this war, we are all, familiar with the very disturbing phenomena that we see today within some circles in the West. That are identifying with Hamas. I'm not talking about circles that are identifying with Gaza, with the people of Gaza. I'm talking about circles that are identifying with Hamas in the West. To the point we see, unfortunately, a very disturbing expression of people, and some of who are coming actually from more liberal circles that are praising Hamas and glorifying Hamas. And this is, of course, very disturbing. I would say that it is disturbing, but it's not surprising, at least not for me. I was describing this process already in its making in my previous books in 2022. In 2016, I was observing that there is a very dangerous process where anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, now anti-Semitic expressions are intertwined with what I call the crisis of education in the West. And my observation was and is, and I think right now it's very much proven, is that the nature of this distorted connection is that the more the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic perspectives and sentiments deepen, the more the educational crisis deepen. And the more the educational crisis deepen, the more the sentiments of anti-Israel and anti-Semitism deepen. And actually, this is kind of like a very danger loop that we see today. It's bitter fruits on the ground with different expressions that we are all familiar with. And, you know, talking about the whole issue of the crisis of education, you know, I'm since the war where I've been doing hundreds of briefings in person, on Zoom. And the one clear thing that came across very clearly is that people basically says, look, we need knowledge, we need understanding. We don't have this knowledge. We are craving for the knowledge. And that's not by chance, because there is no educational system that was supposed to provide that knowledge. It doesn't exist. And that the quintessential, I would say, of the representing that crisis is in this. This is a poster that I came across in social media that allegedly was done by students in Harvard. I don't know to say if it's correct or incorrect, but I do know to say that it clearly represents the quintessential, the core failure of the educational system. Because it reflects exactly the challenge that results is this educational failure. And that is the fact that the educational process became to a large extent flattened. It was flattened with, you know, discussion that is dominated by sound bites and slogans and concepts and theories and buzzwords, that they all sound wonderful. They sometimes sound very romantic and idealistic, but they rarely offer any ability to understand the complex reality. They basically flatten the complex world to something very flat. And it's a distorted process, because when you look, for example, at that poster, obviously you could see the dominant slogans that are out there in the discussion, if I could use the word discussion. But you don't see October 7. You don't see hostages. It does not exist. When you look closer, and I was looking closer, here you see it in a big version. I saw it on a small screen. I saw there is a little word in the bottom, context, but it's very little, because this is exactly the accurate description of what happened to this significant word in the educational, if I can use this word, educational system in the West in the last generation. There is a need for a deep paradigm shift in the educational system. This thing that we see has to be replaced with that. This is the essence of education. Context in big letters, critical thinking, media literacy, understanding the nuance, understanding the chronology of events, what comes first, what comes second, understanding the connection between cause and outcomes, actions and reactions. These are all things that have been pushed aside in the, again, I'm using the word discussion. I'm not so sure it's the right way, but I'm using this word. And so one of the bitter fruits of that is what we see today in the anti-Semitic sentiments and the venomous rhetoric that we see in some circles. But it's not, the damage doesn't end there. The damage is going wide and deep, because these are the building blocks of a healthy, functioning society. If you move those building blocks and you replace them with that, the structure is going to disintegrate. I think that we have a clear manifestation with that in the fact that what we see around is a clearly process of polarization. This is, among other things, this polarization is the outcome of that. It's not the only reason, but this is a major reason for that polarization. So there is the need for the paradigm shift of the educational system. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point I'm concluding my briefing and opening this session to your questions. Sir.
What would be your advice to the government of Israel with regard to the Gaza Strip at this point?
My advice to the government of Israel would be to first, of course, to prioritize the issue of releasing the hostages, and at the same time also making sure that this war will create the strategic change that we need to see. To put it in other words, if we want to offer Israelis and Palestinians any kind of hope, Hamas must be crushed. If Hamas will be able to continue and dictate its radical agenda, there is no hope to Israelis and Palestinians.
So Israel should continue its attacks at the Gaza Strip.
Israel should stick to the objectives that were defined by the government, which includes eliminating Hamas military power and ending its rule in Gaza Strip, yes. You got a mic coming.
Oh, thank you. I was wondering with like the Ring of Fire, why didn't everybody else join in on October 7th and launch a real attack?
Yes, indeed, Hamas leaders, as you can understand, are very frustrated and angry with the fact that the others didn't really join in full scale. There has been some very angry messages from Hamas leaders to Hezbollah, to the Iranian regime. Look, Hamas, out of a fear that the specific date of the attack would be leaked, Hamas kept it in secret from its bodies, from Hezbollah and others, and basically notified them very shortly before the attack. In the hours after the attack, there has been some sort of confusion within Hezbollah's leadership because they didn't understand exactly what's going on in the south part of Israel. The picture was not clear. Meanwhile, that time, Israel was already deploying massive forces. The whole reserves were basically called in. The whole army was put in a higher alarm. And so at those hours, basically the element of surprise was kind of like lost for the Hezbollah. The Iraqi Shiite militias never really have the intention to fully participate in this whole thing to start with because of different reasons. One of the reasons is that within the Iraqi Shiite camp, there is an inner power struggle. There is a major Iraqi Shiite camp that is very much resentful of the Iranian influence in Iraq. And that camp has its own military power. And then you got the Iraqi Shiite militias that are backed by the Iranians, and there has been a tension between these two camps. So as we are talking about the Iraqi Shiite camps, to start with, their involvement full scale in this war was limited to start with. The Houthis is the same story. And so in the end of the day, practically speaking, those elements didn't really join in full scale to the war. There was another reason, a very significant one, and that is the fact that immediately following the attack on October 7, President Biden sent a very strong message to Hezbollah in the Iranians, and basically saying to them, don't, meaning stay out. And he backed that with the deployment of a massive US military power in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. That basically deterred the Hezbollah and the Iranians. And one other thing, particularly when we talk about the Hezbollah, Lebanon is a crumbling state. And a all-out war of Israel and the Hezbollah will result in with the final disintegration of Lebanon. A process that could be very likely involved with a civil war in Lebanon. The Syrians, Assad regime is currently kind of like trying to somehow secure the remains of its control, but there are parts in Syria that still the war is going on. There is in the northern part of Syria, there is a Turkish protectorate. In the northwest part of Syria, there is power base of Islamic organizations that are fighting against Assad. In the southern part of Syria, there is a growing discontent within the Druze and the Arab tribes in the south part of Syria to the point they could become an opposition to Assad. Assad regime doesn't really have the appetite, sort of speaking, to be involved in such a all-out war. And remember one more thing, I mean, in such a war, given to the fact that there has been a deployment of a massive military power of the United States very close to the shores of Lebanon and Syria, and the fact that in such a war Israel will take off all the gloves, the assets that the Iranian regime was building in Syria in decades, those assets could be significantly damaged within hours. A massive air power could cause such a damage, and the Iranians are doing the math, so to speaking. So these are a couple of major reasons why the others, in the end of the day, did not join in, not in a full scale. Sir.
Yeah. Oh, hello. Hi. So you touched a little bit on Palestinian society, and I think one of the many elephants in the room, it's the primary one on my mind, is that my understanding is Palestinian society at large doesn't want to accept a Jewish state. And you mentioned that Fatah does. Over the course of the past 10 years, starting at my time at UCLA, I've been spearheading efforts to get Jews and Palestinians to sit at a table and just listen to each other. It's been extremely difficult to get Palestinians to sit down with us. On the rare occasion that it happens, without exception, they are ostracized by their community, and they often receive threats of bodily harm. This is also, I've witnessed this happen to Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, for example. So, even if Hamas is defanged and no longer capable of ruling in Gaza or the West Bank, I mean, am I tracking some? Am I accurate here? In that there's a serious concern that Palestinian society is just not in a place to currently, and largely rejecting peace with Israel. There's also a concern that some segment of Palestinian society would accept a Palestinian state alongside a Jewish state for the time being, and use that as a tool to develop better capabilities to contend with Israel's military.
Yes, thank you. Look, one of the most significant things about this war is what I call the ripple effect, the aftershock waves. This is a tectonic plate movement, and it results in aftershock waves. Some of those aftershock waves already reached the shore. Some of them are heading to shores. And I am very much interested to follow those coming ripples, because I assume and I predict that there will be some significant impact of those aftershock waves, both within the Israeli inner discussion as well as the inner Palestinian discussion. And you are right in your observation when you say that to a large extent there is reluctance, if not objection, within Palestinian society in wide circles to the existence of the state of Israel or to the concept of reconciling with Israel. I think that it's important to understand that in the context of the inner Palestinian discussion, the most dominant narrative is the one that basically centers around the issue of victimhood. And so there is a need for the Palestinians to go through this inner process of redefining what is the role of in this victimhood in their narratives, what is going to be the role of this narrative in further shaping their trajectory ahead. Up until now, that has been the major narrative that was shaping the Palestinian cause. And as an outcome of that, it results, among other things, that when there are, as you said, Palestinians who are willing to sit to the table or want to be engaged in a dialogue, they are being threatened by their own brothers, because the narrative of the victimhood is so powerful that it dictates uniformity. If you are stepping out of that narrative, you are basically threatening the narrative. And if you are threatening the narrative, you are basically damaging the cause. And so that's the reason why, as long as this narrative of victimhood within Palestinians, I'm talking about Palestinians, obviously there are narratives within the Israelis that have to be revised as well. But referring to your question, talking about the Palestinians, it will be indeed very difficult to see this shift within the inner Palestinian discussion. And that goes back to what I said, when it will be interesting to see what will be the impact of the aftershock waves in the context of the inner Palestinian discussion about the story of victimhood. That is some other interesting aspect that has to do with the context of the inner Western discussion vis-a-vis the story of the Palestinians. The circles in the West who advocates or support Hamas or supports the Palestinians basically, to a large extent, perpetuate and deepen the concept of victimhood within the Palestinians themselves, and the result is ironically the opposite of the intention. And I'll assuming there are, yes, and I believe that many of those people who basically are coming from a place that says we want to see peace, we want to see whatever, and in the context of Gaza Strip, the manifestation of that ironic outcome is in the sense that, as I said before, Western circles constantly insist to exempt Hamas from responsibility, because the concept of victimhood is so profoundly embedded that they can't see a thing that is called governmental responsibility, which is very strange, because this is one of the major core values of Western society, governmental responsibility. And so when, by not holding Hamas accountable, which, by the way, remember, the Arab world is holding Hamas accountable. The Arab world is saying to Hamas, you are responsible for Gaza Strip because you took over Gaza Strip. By exempting Hamas from responsibility, those Western circles first deepen the victimhood narrative and thus shrink the abilities of the Palestinians to start a new dialogue. And in addition to that, by exempting Hamas from responsibility, from a governmental responsibility, they basically suffocated or discouraged the voices of Palestinians who basically opposes Hamas way. So you got here a very tragic situation where people that are coming, some of them maybe are not coming from a genuine place, but let's say that most of them are coming from a genuine place to do something good, to have a positive impact. In the end of the day, out of that approach resulted the totally opposite objective. I want to enable. Yes, yes, that's fine. That's all fine.
One of the things that we're hearing, one of the narratives that's being played out in the West is that Netanyahu is not so eager to create any sort of a hostage deal or any engage in any sort of talks of any sort of ceasefire in the fear that when the war ends, that his government will topple. Is that what do you think about that? Because I can't tell if that's just a Western take on it or if it's accurate. So I'd appreciate your thoughts.
Yes, look, again, I would have to say that it will be my own, really not as an expert on Middle East, but as someone who tries to understand that specific issue, looking at it as an Israeli and as a Jew. I would say there is something into that. I think that Netanyahu, to the best of my understanding, Netanyahu is engaged in two major issues: the trial and his the charges that he's facing, and also I think also the issue of the legacy. I think also bothers Netanyahu. I think that look, Netanyahu thus far is kind of like avoiding to take responsibility, but you probably know that in the Israeli public opinion, the overwhelming sentiment basically says like you can't ignore responsibility. It happens in your shift. You are the prime minister. And I think that, again, I'm not a psychologist, but it seems to me like Netanyahu is bothered by the way that his legacy is going to be viewed. And I think that for Netanyahu, the war, actually he views the war in a way as something that could serve him in a way in those two objectives. But again, this is my, it's just something that I think is kind of like echoed around in the discussions. So
assuming that Hamas will be militarily defeated, in weeks, months, or whatever it takes, what do you see happening in the next 10 years?
10 years is a lot of time in the Middle East. Next week. But I want to take this kind of like as a segue to talk a little bit about the issue of what is called the two-state solution. Look, I've been saying for many years in my positions and not in my positions, I've been saying all along, look, two-state solution is not viable. Not because I don't want peace or because I don't want to see two-state solution. Personally, I do want to see the Palestinians have their own state. That lives as a good neighbor next to the state of Israel, personally. It's because simply the two people are not in a place where they can really move forward to create a positive model of two-state solution. It's not a game of blame. I find both Israelis and Palestinians responsible for their reality. I'm not an Israeli spokesperson. I'm not a Palestinian spokesperson. Nobody is paying my salary. I'm not a member in any political party. So I can freely say that. And so as long as Israelis and Palestinians are not, and up until now they didn't really have gone through this agonizing process that is required to do, to compromise over some major narratives, they won't be able to come to the table and really build the process that result in a two-state solution that is a positive one. And the other thing that I said all along was, there has been no doubt in my mind that in the end of the day, any kind of an Israeli-Palestinian arrangement must be done in a context of what I call regional envelope, meaning bringing to the picture the major Arab states. The Palestinians are part of the Arab states and the Arab world. And only with the involvement proactively of those players, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the United Arab Emirates, only with their practical, proactive involvement, there is a chance to basically create what I call scaffoldings. And those scaffoldings will be the foundations upon which Israelis and Palestinians could start dealing with a long-term process of arrangements on the ground. I don't even use the term peace. I don't even use the term agreements, arrangements. And I think that other thing that we should apply thinking about it is that I'm always talking about the need for out-of-the-box thinking. We need to think out of the box here. always. That's a good idea. And for example, when I'm talking about out-of-the-box thinking, I'm saying, look, let's think about, for example, if we're talking about scaffoldings and the regional players that are proactively involved, let's think about creation of external entity that is going to be recognized internationally by the United Nations and the Security Council. That external entity will include Palestinians and the Arab states, and they will be basically empowered and authorized internationally to come with initiatives, to offer initiatives, to negotiate with Israel, to sign an arrangement, to sign an agreement, and they will be the guarantor of arrangements and agreement. And this will be a temporary entity for 25 years or 50 years. And during that period of time, among the authorities of that entity will be to create civil society, to create economic infrastructure, to create trade capacities, to develop an up-to-date 21st century and onwards technologies that could be applied in a modern societies. That will be the role, and I think that this is an example of what I call of thinking out of the box. I think these are the things that we have to try and to enhance, to advance. And in the context of, also looking ahead, one of the things that I'm very much interested to follow, and I'm of course going to follow very closely to see what will be the impact of these aftershock waves in the context of the inner Palestinian political map. Is it going, for example, to result in the emerge of a new political Palestinian player, maybe a combination of Fatah and Hamas? Maybe. I'm not excluding that possibility. So, to the best of my ability, this is how I will portray the period coming ahead.
Yes, thank you. The malignant nature of Hamas has been evident since its formation, and especially evident to us here in the United States in 2006 when they had the coup. There are a lot of reports in the media about essentially complicity of the Israeli government with supporting Hamas and sort of playing off Hamas against Fatah in order to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. I mean, I think that's ridiculous and horrendous, but I want your opinion and view, and is that true?
Look, I'm familiar with that argument, and some people say that when Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel, was leading the disengagement, that was his basically guiding incentive, that he wanted actually to result or to create this Hamas-Fatah split. And through that, basically, to avoid the need to come to a solution with the Palestinians, because he will say, well, who are we talking with? Are we talking with Hamas? Are we talking with Fatah? So this narrative exists in the Israeli public opinion. The same applies as in the context of Netanyahu government. It is possible. I would not exclude that. It's possible. I don't have the ability to say decisively that was the case. What has been decisively proved as a case is the fact that during Netanyahu's government particularly, not only, there has been this arrangement with Qatar providing Hamas with the money on a monthly basis. I think that there is a need to look at this also in a wider context and to look at the whole inner Israeli discussion vis-a-vis the story of Gaza Strip, particularly following 2007. And here there is something significant to remember. In the end of the day, all the governments, the Israeli governments since 2007, and there were a couple of Israeli governments, most of them Netanyahu's governments, but also one of them not. The bottom line of their policy towards Gaza Strip was, we are staying out of Gaza Strip. We are doing almost everything possible not to go back to Gaza Strip. That policy reflects the Israeli public opinion, the Israeli Jewish public opinion dominating outlook that time. Because though Israel has been dealing with the challenge of terror and rockets and missiles and all those things, and the very challenging reality of repeating military rounds, and in between that periods of calmness, the overwhelming perspective on the Israeli Jewish public opinion was, we rather live with that other than going back to Gaza Strip, taking control back on 2 million Palestinians. We don't want to do that. And there was another thing that was very significantly present in this calculation, was the concern about the loss of soldiers' life, and the fact that soldiers could be, or possibility that soldiers could be kidnapped. These were all very strong elements in the Israeli public opinion all those years until October 7th. Following October 7, it's changed. But those were the major, and so I think that it's important to take those components into consideration when we are talking about what guided the Israeli policy vis-a-vis Gaza Strip between, let's say, between 2005, when Israel withdrew from Gaza Strip, until October 7, 2023. Those were the things that were guiding the policy and dictating, to a large extent, the policy of the governments. Ma'am.
Sorry. You just talked about the long-term forecast for Gaza, but what about the short term? Obviously, there's millions of people living in tents. We see it online. What do you foresee as how that's going to rectify itself in the next 6 months or even 3 months?
Yeah. First, I don't think there are millions of people living in tents. There are a large number of people that don't have houses. They lost their houses, particularly in the northern part of Gaza. I don't know to say the accurate number of Gaza people who live in tents. I do need to make this statement because as an intelligence person, I'm always, I want to be careful with, presenting reality the accurate way. Israel is going to stay in Gaza Strip in the foreseeable future, particularly military presence. We may also see an increasing political pressure in Israel to start rebuilding communities in Gaza Strip. But I don't think that this is something that is going to be implemented on the ground.
Do you think that will happen, that Israel will?
I don't think so. I said that I think that we'll see political pressure from circle wings in the right wing in Israel, but I don't think that we'll see that. I do think that talking about predictions, my prediction is that the upcoming government in Israel will be the one that, to a large extent, will go back to this, what I call the central pragmatic Zionist camp. We will see strengthening of the right wing, apparently voices that will come from the Likud party, maybe. But I think that the upcoming government, whether the elections are going to be before the date or on the date, I think that we'll see a government that is basically going back to the major Israeli Zionist Jewish pragmatic camp. And therefore, I don't think that we'll see establishing of communities in Gaza Strip, but we'll see a military presence in Gaza Strip. We'll probably see renewal of some sort of already exist in a way, a civil administration and military rule as it was before 2005. Israel left Gaza Strip in 2005 and was forced to go back to Gaza Strip against its will.
Right. And I think it's important, it's important that you corrected that because there's so much misinformation on social media coming from Gaza that shows so much devastation, people living in tents and et cetera, et cetera. So it's important to, I think, just kind of correct the record in general, coming from Israel, explaining this is not as bad as it looks, because it certainly looks bad. And it's just
No,
hard for
it's-
us
it's-
all to imagine, what's going to happen in the next 3 months.
Yeah, look, I want to be clear. It's bad what's happening in Gaza Strip. It's not walking in the park. People are dying in Gaza Strip. There is a lot of there is a crisis, significant crisis in Gaza Strip. I just say that we need to be cautious when we are trying to act, to reflect as much as possible the picture on the ground. For example, in one of my interviews, I think it was the BBC, and the reporter, she started with making statements. She said, like, 80% of the buildings demolished, and I said, like, how do you know? I don't know. And she basically take that, and she said, you know what, you're right. I mean, there is a need to look carefully at information, particularly statistics, and I don't know to say. The same things is, by the way, Israeli Defense Forces says, we killed 14,000 militants of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and I basically ask, how do you know? How do you know that? I mean, again, I'm kind of like applying here my lenses of critical thinking, and so I think it's important to do that. Yeah, it's a tragic situation, and it is what it is. This is what we are dealing with. Yes, please.
Oh, no pressure. Well, first I wanted to say thank you for your presentation. I think that this regional context, we all talk about like nuance and the Israel-Palestine history, but it's a much bigger problem than what we're looking at. So I think this context is really critical, so thanks. Second, the question that I want to ask follows on, which essentially comes down to what do we do, right? Like as the average American with no big political influence, how do we change this narrative? What is our part that we play? Especially we're looking at an election year, so I can only imagine that the public opinion matters in the sense that people are trying to get elected, so we're playing our own game here. And we've talked also about there's just large misinformation because we're fighting our own war, which is our social media and our online war, right? And my generation especially loves to look at TikToks and all this, and it's so grossly misinformed at worst and at best just biased. So what do we do in our day-to-day?
Yes, well, actually, to a large extent, you gave some part of the answer in the beginning of your question when you talked about how important it is to have this context and nuance and understanding of the big picture. In other words, in the most individual circle, you have probably, I don't know, you probably know a lot of people, and you're probably, I guess, active in social media, like many other young people. Simply to echo this experience. Yes, this whole thing is filmed and it's going to be available on the channel on YouTube. And so basically just to start with, to share it with people as much as possible. I mean, each and every one of us has circles of people as we know, and just to start to create this ripple effect, like throwing stone into the water. And this is one thing. The other thing is, if you have channels of communication to policymakers or to politicians in the local level or not maybe the national level, whatever, it's also a very legitimate venue to act and to say to these people, I want to draw your attention to that. I want to understand that. It's important to do that. So again, it's in coming back in the whole individual level, these are the practical things that I think that are doable. If you're talking about levels of organizations that have resources and stuff like that, this is a different story. But I guess that you ask me like in the most practical individual level, and these are, I think, the practical tools that I can, I think that they are easily can be implemented. And I hope that you will do that. This is the whole idea. The whole idea here is to do this paradigm shift and basically say, look, it's about time to start looking at this whole story. It's the right way it should be looked at. Yeah. Not through these narrow lenses, but...
Thank you.
You're welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, Tuda, thank you very much and shalom. Good night.